a man entered heaven without first passing through death. That is the extraordinary possibility hidden inside one of the shortest and strangest passages in Genesis. His name was Enoch. The biblical account gives almost no explanation. It simply says that Enoch walked with God, and then he was no longer there, because God took him. No grave is described, no final illness, no burial. He simply disappears. But centuries of Jewish and Christian tradition would wrestle with what those few words actually meant. And an ancient collection of writings bearing Enoch's name tells a much larger story. In those texts, Enoch does not merely vanish. He crosses terrifying landscapes, encounters supernatural beings, witnesses places of judgment, and is shown mysteries normally concealed from humanity. Yet historians must separate ancient belief from historical evidence. The surviving manuscripts were composed and transmitted across generations, not written personally by the Genesis patriarch. So who, according to these traditions, was actually taken alive into heaven? Before this investigation ends, three things will become clear: what the oldest traditions claim happened to Enoch, why the manuscripts complicate that story, and how one mysterious man became a bridge between earth and heaven. The mystery begins with only a few lines. In Genesis 5, the descendants of Adam appear almost like names carved into stone. A man lives, he fathers children, he grows old, then he dies, again and again. The same ending returns, and he died. Then Enoch appears. The rhythm suddenly breaks. Ancient text Genesis says, Enoch lived 65 years before becoming the father of Methuselah. Afterward, he walked with God for 300 years. Then comes the sentence that created centuries of speculation. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more, because God took him. The text does not explicitly describe a journey through the sky. It does not describe angels carrying him upward. It does not even use the word heaven in that sentence. It simply says God took him, and that distinction matters. Mainstream scholarly view. Many biblical scholars understand the passage as deliberately exceptional. Every other major figure surrounding Enoch in the genealogy receives a death formula. Enoch does not. Exactly what the earliest writer intended remains debated, but the literary contrast is difficult to miss. Enoch's ending is different. Possible interpretation. Later readers naturally asked whether God took him meant that Enoch escaped ordinary death. The New Testament letter to the Hebrews would eventually interpret the tradition explicitly, saying Enoch was taken so that he would not experience death. But the next source changes everything, because somewhere within ancient Judaism, Enoch's disappearance became much more than a mysterious ending. It became a journey. The work now called 1 Enoch survives completely in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. Portions were also preserved in Greek, while fragments discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrated that major Enochic writings circulated in Jewish communities centuries before Christianity. That archaeological evidence is crucial. It does not prove that Enoch entered heaven. It proves something historically different. And far more defensible ancient Jewish communities were reading traditions about Enoch long before medieval manuscript copies appeared. And those traditions place him inside a terrifying cosmic crisis. The story begins not with Enoch ascending, but with beings descending. They are called the Watchers. According to 1 Enoch, these heavenly beings look down upon human women and desire them. They descend, bind themselves by an oath, take wives, and teach humanity forbidden knowledge. The consequences spread across the earth. Violence grows, blood is spilled, the natural order begins to collapse, and Enoch becomes involved because heaven requires a messenger. But there is an unsettling reversal. The angels do not initially bring God's message to Enoch. The condemned watchers ask Enoch to carry their message to God. Why him? The text presents Enoch as righteous, apparently giving him a status that makes him suitable to approach the divine realm on their behalf. The watchers cannot repair what they have done, so they ask a human being to petition heaven. Most readers stop here. What happens next is even stranger. Ancient text Enoch describes receiving a vision in which he is carried beyond the ordinary human world. He passes through extraordinary regions and eventually approaches what appears to be the divine throne. The imagery becomes almost architectural. There is a structure like crystal. Fire surrounds it. Its floor seems to burn. The atmosphere is overwhelming. At the center stands another house, greater than the first. Enoch enters. He describes intense heat and cold together, a combination that makes the place feel deliberately impossible by ordinary earthly standards. Then he sees the great glory. The language becomes cautious because the figure cannot be described directly. Historical evidence. No archaeological discovery can verify that this journey occurred. What archaeology can establish is the antiquity of the literary tradition. Aramaic fragments of Enochic works were recovered from Qumran near the Dead Sea. Their existence pushed scholarly discussion far beyond the old assumption that Enoch was simply a late Christian curiosity. Imagine the landscape where some of those manuscripts survived. The cliffs west of the Dead Sea rise pale and dry beneath a relentless sun. Dust settles into crevices. The water below lies dark blue against an almost lifeless shoreline. Inside caves cut into those cliffs, fragments of manuscripts survived for roughly 2,000 years. Among them were pieces of Enoch. That changed the historical question. Scholars no longer had to ask whether the Enochic tradition existed before Christianity. It clearly did. But that was only the beginning. The Enochic writings do not describe one simple trip into heaven. They preserve layers of journeys, visions, astronomical revelations, judgment scenes, and encounters with supernatural beings in one journey. Enoch travels toward the extremities of the earth. Mountains rise before him. Waters appear. Winds move through cosmic gateways. He sees places associated with imprisoned stars and rebellious angels. The geography sounds physical, yet it operates according to an ancient cosmology very different from modern astronomy. This is where interpretation becomes difficult. Mainstream scholarly view scholars generally approach these descriptions as Jewish apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic texts reveal hidden realities through visions, symbolic journeys, angels, cosmic geography, and divine secrets. The question is therefore not simply whether an ancient traveler physically visited locations recognizable on a modern map. The more historically useful question is what these landscapes meant to the people who composed and preserved the traditions. And one repeated idea stands out. The universe has boundaries. Heaven has order. Stars have appointed paths. Angels have assigned responsibilities. Human beings have limits. The watchers violate those limits by descending. Enoch becomes extraordinary because he is permitted to cross in the opposite direction. That symmetry is easy to overlook. Heavenly beings descend illegally. A human being ascends with divine permission. The entire story turns on the difference. But another mystery appears. If Enoch was allowed to enter heavenly realms while alive, did he remain human? Later traditions would answer that question in dramatically different ways. Some portray him primarily as a righteous visionary. Others expand his heavenly status far beyond what Genesis ever says. And still others connect him with transformations that belong to much later mystical traditions. Those traditions cannot simply be combined as though they came from one period. Their dates matter, their languages matter, their communities matter. So does one surprisingly important detail. Enoch is not the only biblical figure associated with escaping an ordinary death. 2 Kings describes the prophet Elijah being separated from Elisha by a fiery chariot and horses of fire before Elijah goes upward in a whirlwind. That account is much more visually explicit than Genesis. Now the original question becomes harder. When people say the Bible describes someone being taken alive into heaven, are they talking about Enoch, Elijah, or both? The answer depends on which text we are reading and how literally its language is understood. Genesis says God took Enoch. Hebrews later interprets this as avoiding death. 2 Kings describes Elijah ascending in a whirlwind. And first, Enoch builds an enormous visionary tradition around Enoch's access to heavenly secrets. These are related ideas. They are not identical claims. That distinction becomes essential because the Book of Enoch contains a passage that has caused one of the most fascinating identity debates in the entire collection. Enoch is shown a mysterious heavenly figure. He asks who this figure is, and the answer seems straightforward until the manuscripts, translations, and structure of the text are examined more closely. Because if one controversial reading is taken seriously, Enoch's journey may not end with him merely visiting heaven. It may change who readers think Enoch becomes. The complication appears in a section of 4 Enoch, commonly called the parables, or similitudes of Enoch. Here, the atmosphere changes. Enoch is no longer concerned only with the fallen watchers. He is shown scenes of final judgment and repeatedly encounters an exalted figure described through titles such as the Chosen One, the Righteous One, and the Son of Man. Ancient text. At one point, Enoch asks about this mysterious figure. Earlier passages describe the Son of Man as existing in God's presence and participating in judgment. For an ancient reader, the obvious question is unavoidable. Who is he? Near the conclusion of the parables, something remarkable happens in the surviving Ethiopic text. Language appears that some translations have understood as identifying Enoch himself with this Son of Man figure. If that reading is correct, the entire journey changes. Enoch has spent the visions looking toward a mysterious heavenly individual. Then, near the end, the boundary between observer and figure seems to collapse. But this is exactly where historians become cautious. Historical evidence. Unlike several other portions of Horse Enoch, no Aramaic fragments of the parables have been securely identified among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That absence does not prove the parables were written late. Absence from the surviving caves is not evidence of non-existence, but it leaves scholars without the early Aramaic manuscript evidence available for other Enochic sections. The complete form reaches us principally through the Ethiopian tradition, and translation matters. The relevant Ge'ez wording has generated substantial debate over whether Enoch is literally being identified as the Son of Man, being associated with that figure, or receiving a designation whose precise meaning has shifted during transmission. This is where historians disagree. Mainstream scholarly view. There is no scholarly consensus that the Book of Enoch straightforwardly teaches that the historical Enoch became a divine being. Some specialists have argued for an identification between Enoch and the Son of Man within the final chapters of the parables. Others have proposed different grammatical or literary readings. Still others emphasize that the Son of Man appears to exist as a heavenly figure before Enoch's apparent identification with him. That creates a serious problem. How can Enoch meet or contemplate a figure whom he later seems to become? Perhaps the answer lies in visionary symbolism. Perhaps the final passage represents exaltation rather than literal identity. Perhaps the text contains layers composed or edited at different stages. Or perhaps ancient apocalyptic authors were comfortable with categories modern readers expect to remain separate. The manuscript can't settle the issue for us, but the twist goes deeper. Later Jewish mystical traditions dramatically expand Enoch's transformation. A much later work known as 3 Enoch presents Enoch as the exalted angel Metatron. That tradition is striking, but it must not be projected backward into the much earlier Book of the Watchers. They are separated by centuries of religious development. Still, their relationship tells us something important. Enoch's unexplained disappearance in Genesis created narrative space. Ancient writers filled that space. If he did not die like the patriarchs around him, where did he go? If God took him, what did he see? If he entered heaven alive, could he return unchanged? Every generation could push the question further. Possible interpretation. The oldest mystery may therefore have been less about transportation and more about transformation. Enoch becomes a uniquely useful figure because he stands at a boundary. He is human, yet receives heavenly knowledge. He belongs to earth, yet travels through cosmic regions. He witnesses rebellious angels because he represents the opposite movement, a righteous human admitted into the realm the Watchers abandoned. And later traditions amplify that status until Enoch can become something far greater than the quiet patriarch of Genesis. But this raises an even larger question. Why do his journeys contain gates for winds, chambers for stars, mountains of extraordinary substances, fiery regions, and carefully ordered celestial movements? To modernize. These can sound like descriptions of impossible places to an ancient audience. They belonged to a recognizable way of imagining the structure of creation. And when archaeology, ancient astronomy, and the languages surrounding Enoch are placed beside those descriptions, the journey begins to look different again, not more easily explained, but historically much richer. To understand what Enoch believed he was seeing, we have to resist one temptation. We cannot place a modern map of the universe over an ancient one. The writers behind the Enochic traditions lived in a world without telescopes, satellites, or knowledge of planetary orbits as we understand them today. Their universe was interpreted through naked eye observation, inherited cosmology, religious tradition, and patterns repeated across generations. That does not make their observations meaningless. In some ways, it makes them more revealing. Ancient text. One section of 1 Enoch, usually called the Astronomical Book, describes the movements of the sun and moon through a system of heavenly gates. Enoch is guided by the angel Uriel. He watches the sun emerge through different gates at different seasons. The length of daylight changes. Nights lengthen and shorten. Lunar phases are counted. The description is not modern astronomy, yet it reflects something real. The sky changes predictably. For communities dependent on seasons, agriculture, festivals, and calendars, those changes mattered enormously. And this is where the mystery becomes more complicated. Historical evidence. Ancient Near Eastern societies had been observing celestial cycles long before the surviving Enochic manuscripts were copied. Babylonian scholars, in particular, developed sophisticated traditions of recording celestial phenomena. Generations of observation allowed specialists to recognize recurring patterns involving the moon, planets, eclipses, and seasons. Jewish communities did not develop in isolation from this larger intellectual environment. During centuries of interaction with Mesopotamian and other Near Eastern cultures, ideas moved across political and linguistic boundaries. Some researchers have therefore examined Enochic astronomy alongside older Mesopotamian traditions. The similarities are intriguing, although they do not mean the Book of Enoch simply copied one Babylonian source. The cultural history is more complicated than that, but another detail deserves attention. The astronomical book is interested not merely in where celestial bodies appear, it is interested in order. The sun has a course, the moon has a course, the stars have appointed positions, time itself appears regulated. When that order is violated, the language can become moral. This makes sense inside the larger Enochic universe. The Watchers are condemned because they abandoned their appointed station. Certain stars are also portrayed as being punished after failing to obey divine commands. For the writers, astronomy and theology could occupy the same conceptual world. Modern science separates physical processes from moral behavior. The Enochic texts do not always make that separation, and that difference is essential. Otherwise, we risk turning ancient symbolism into modern scientific claims it was never designed to make. But the celestial imagery is only one part of Enoch's journey. His geography is equally strange. He travels toward remote extremities. He encounters enormous mountains. He sees deep valleys and regions of fire. There are waters, winds, darkness, and places inaccessible to ordinary human beings. At moments, the landscape feels almost terrestrial. At others, it becomes unmistakably cosmic. Cold darkness gives way to fire. Rock rises into impossible formations. The sound of rushing waters enters descriptions of places no ordinary traveler could reach. Distance becomes difficult to measure. The horizon itself seems to function like a boundary. What were ancient readers supposed to imagine mainstream scholarly view? Scholars often compare such descriptions with broader ancient Near Eastern cosmological geography. Ancient peoples frequently imagined the inhabited world as part of a structured cosmos containing regions inaccessible to normal humans. Mountains could mark cosmic boundaries. The underworld might possess entrances. The heavens could contain chambers or storehouses. Winds and waters could be imagined as emerging from controlled cosmic locations. These were not crude attempts at writing 21st century physics. They were systems for explaining an ordered universe using the intellectual categories available at the time. The next detail is rarely discussed outside specialist circles. Language itself preserves traces of that world. The Enochic writings survive through multiple linguistic environments. Much of Emerson Enoch was originally composed in Aramaic. Although portions and textual histories remain subjects of study, fragments survive in Aramaic from Qumran. Additional material survives in Greek, and the complete collection is preserved in Ge'ez. Each stage of transmission creates possibilities for variation. A word describing a heavenly object may carry several associations. A title can acquire theological significance. A phrase that sounds precise in one translation may be less precise in another. That becomes particularly important when people attempt to interpret Enoch through modern categories. Some popular theories have suggested that descriptions of fiery vehicles, heavenly structures, or luminous beings might preserve memories of advanced technology. There is no accepted archaeological evidence establishing that interpretation. Possible interpretation. Some researchers and popular writers have noted that ancient descriptions of ascent can sound technological when translated into modern vocabulary. Fire moves, structures shine, beings descend from above. A human traveler is carried beyond familiar territory. The comparison can be imaginative, but similarity of imagery is not proof of identical phenomena. An ancient author describing divine radiance is not automatically describing machinery. A heavenly chamber is not automatically a spacecraft. Historical method requires the ancient vocabulary to be understood in its own cultural setting before modern explanations are imposed upon it. And when that is done, another possibility becomes more interesting. Enoch may tell us less about hidden technology and more about how ancient people organized knowledge. Astronomy, morality, calendar calculation, sacred geography, angelology, and political judgment could all become parts of one connected universe. Enoch is the traveler who moves through that universe. He sees how its pieces supposedly fit together. That helps explain why he is such an effective literary figure. Genesis gives almost no details about his disappearance. The Enochic writers could therefore place him almost anywhere without directly contradicting a detailed biblical biography. He could travel east. He could reach the ends of the earth. He could stand before angels. He could learn celestial cycles. He could witness the prison of rebellious beings. and ultimately, he could approach heaven itself. But archaeology gives us one more grounding point. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that Enochic literature was not merely a forgotten fantasy revived in modern times. It circulated within ancient Jewish textual culture. Fragments were copied, handled, stored, and eventually left in caves near the Dead Sea. Real hands wrote those words. Real communities preserved them. What those communities believed about every vision is harder to establish. Possessing a text does not tell us precisely how every reader interpreted it, yet its preservation demonstrates significance. And that creates the next mystery. If Enochic traditions were circulating so early, and if some ancient Jewish communities clearly valued them, why is the Book of Enoch absent from most Bibles today? The answer is not that someone simply erased it. The actual history is slower, more complicated, and perhaps more revealing. The Book of Enoch did not disappear in a single moment. There was no known council where Christian leaders gathered around a table, condemned Enoch, and ordered every copy destroyed. The historical story is far less dramatic and far more interesting. Historical evidence. By the centuries surrounding the beginning of Christianity, Enochic traditions were already circulating within Judaism. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide physical evidence of that circulation. Multiple Aramaic manuscript fragments associated with Enochic works were found at Qumran. Then another ancient text gives us an important clue. The New Testament letter of Jude contains language closely corresponding to 1st Enoch. Jude explicitly attributes a prophecy to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. That matters. It demonstrates that an Enochic tradition could be treated seriously within an early Christian text that eventually became part of the New Testament. Yet quotation does not automatically establish the canonical status of an entire book. Biblical authors could draw upon traditions without necessarily declaring every work containing them to be Scripture. This is where the history becomes more complicated. Mainstream scholarly view. Early Christianity did not begin with one universally fixed table of contents identical in every community. Different Christian groups inherited different collections, languages, reading traditions, and judgments about particular writings. Over time, most churches came to recognize collections that did not include Burger's Enoch. But Enoch was not simply forgotten everywhere. Some early Christian writers knew the traditions. Tertullian, writing around the beginning of the 3rd century, defended Enoch and discussed objections to its authority. Other Christian authors were less willing to grant it scriptural status. As centuries passed, Enoch gradually disappeared from the ordinary biblical tradition of much of Europe and the Mediterranean world. Its influence, however, did not vanish completely. Ideas associated with fallen angels, judgment, and an ancient heavenly rebellion continued through other texts and interpretations. Then something remarkable happened. While much of Western Christianity lost access to the complete work, Ethiopian Christianity preserved it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition transmitted one Enoch in Ge'ez as part of a broader scriptural heritage. This survival is one reason we possess the complete text today. Imagine the distance involved, from the dry caves beside the Dead Sea to Christian manuscript traditions in the Ethiopian highlands. The story crossed languages, kingdoms, religious communities, and centuries. Parchment replaced older manuscript forms, scripts changed, empires disappeared, yet Enoch survived. The next detail is rarely discussed in popular claims that the book was simply abandoned. Canon formation was not identical everywhere. Different religious traditions developed different boundaries around Scripture. A book absent from one canon could remain authoritative in another. That distinction matters because modern statements such as, "The Church removed Enoch from the Bible," compress a long and diverse history into a single event for which the evidence is insufficient. Possible interpretation. The more accurate mystery is not who secretly removed Enoch. It is why different communities valued it differently. Part of the answer may involve theology. Part may involve changing interpretive traditions. Part involves language and manuscript availability. And part reflects the complicated process through which communities decided which ancient writings would be publicly read as scripture. Then, centuries later, Western scholars encountered Enoch again. European interest increased when manuscripts of the Ethiopic text became available for study. Translations eventually introduced the work to readers who had known Enoch primarily through Genesis, Jude, and references in early Christian literature. But one question remained: how ancient was the surviving material? The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls transformed that discussion. When Aramaic Enoch fragments emerged from the caves of Qumran, scholars gained direct manuscript evidence connecting significant portions of the Enochic collection to Second Temple Judaism. That did not prove every section had the same date. It did not prove Enoch himself wrote anything. In fact, mainstream scholarship treats one Enoch as a composite collection produced across different periods by anonymous ancient authors. That distinction is fundamental. Ancient text. The work speaks through Enoch. Historical evidence. The surviving compositions come from much later periods than the lifetime traditionally assigned to the patriarch. Mainstream scholarly view. Enoch functions as an authoritative ancient figure through whom later Jewish writers reveal heavenly mysteries. Possible interpretation. His unexplained disappearance in Genesis may have made him particularly suitable for that role. A man whom God took could become the ideal witness to secrets beyond the human world. And this brings us back to the original mystery. Perhaps the survival of Enoch is itself part of the reason the question remains so powerful. The text was preserved in fragments near one of the lowest places on earth. Its complete form survived far away in an ancient African Christian tradition. Modern scholarship brought those witnesses back into conversation. And after all of that recovery, the central sentence in Genesis remains almost as mysterious as before. God took Enoch, but where exactly? After thousands of years of interpretation, the mystery returns to a sentence only a few words long. Enoch walked with God. Then he was gone. Everything else grew around that disappearance. Ancient text Genesis says that God took Enoch, uniquely avoiding the repeated death formula surrounding the other patriarchs. Hebrews later interprets Enoch's fate more explicitly, saying he was taken so that he would not experience death. First, Enoch expands the tradition dramatically. It's Enoch becomes a visionary who crosses forbidden boundaries, encounters angels, witnesses judgment, learns celestial mysteries, and approaches the divine presence. But those statements belong to different texts from different periods. They cannot simply be compressed into one eyewitness account. That distinction gives us the strongest historical foundation. Historical evidence. We have ancient manuscripts showing that Enochic literature circulated within Judaism during the Second Temple period. The Aramaic fragments from Qumran establish that significant Enochic traditions existed long before their complete preservation in medieval Ethiopic manuscripts. The letter of Jude demonstrates that Enochic material was known within early Christianity, and the Ethiopian tradition explains how the complete collection survived when it disappeared from the scriptural collections familiar to most Western Christians. None of this proves that a physical human body entered another realm. Archaeology can date manuscripts. Philology can compare languages. Historians can reconstruct communities. They cannot excavate an ascent into heaven. And that boundary matters. Mainstream scholarly view. First Enoch is generally understood as a composite collection of Jewish apocalyptic writings attributed to the ancient patriarch, rather than a document physically written by Enoch himself. Its cosmic journeys, therefore, reveal something historically valuable, even when their supernatural claims cannot be tested. They show us how ancient communities imagined heaven, judgment, celestial order, rebellious angels, and humanity's place within creation. Yet one uncertainty refuses to disappear. What did the earliest Genesis tradition mean when it said, "God took Enoch"? Was this a deliberate claim that he escaped death? Was it an ancient expression of extraordinary divine favor? Or did an originally brief tradition become increasingly literal as later generations attempted to explain his absence? The evidence does not permit certainty, and Elijah complicates the picture further. If the question is who the Hebrew Bible most vividly describes ascending alive, Elijah possesses the clearer ascent narrative. If the question is who became the great heavenly traveler of later Jewish apocalyptic literature, Enoch dominates the landscape. If the question is who later Christian scripture explicitly says did not experience death, Hebrews points directly to Enoch, so the answer depends upon which ancient witness we allow to speak. Possible interpretation. Perhaps that is why Enoch remained so compelling. His story contains an absence where a death should have been. Later writers looked into that silence and imagined heaven. They filled it with burning chambers, distant mountains, imprisoned angels, celestial gates, stars moving according to appointed laws, and a righteous man standing where ordinary humans could not stand. If those descriptions were intended as literal journeys, they raise questions history cannot presently answer. If they were visionary and symbolic, they reveal something equally significant, an ancient attempt to understand why evil entered the world, why creation possesses order, and whether a human being could cross the boundary separating mortality from the divine. What the texts say is extraordinary. What history can establish is more limited. And what happened to the man behind the tradition remains beyond our reach. Perhaps that is the real reason Enoch has never disappeared. Genesis tells us almost nothing about where he went. For more than 2,000 years, humanity has been trying to finish the sentence.